Welcome to the Bagel Logic Podcast, the show where Papa Tom spreads wisdom like a smear of cream cheese on an everything bagel. Here's your host, Thom Jennings.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Bagel Logic Podcast. And I know typical format is no guest, no guest, guest. I just didn't get a guest this week. Not for lack of trying. I think it gets progressively difficult sometimes, especially when you have a podcast named Bagel Logic. Everybody thinks that you're going to talk about bagel, but I'm going to talk about bagels. Yeah. But this week, there's that humbug again. Humbug. That's what I should call it. You know, like bah humbug, but we'll call it the humbug. So anyhow, this week I decided to tackle a podcast topic that's been kind of ruminating in my head for a while. And, before I begin, everybody that's reached out to me and given me feedback with regard to these Bagel Logic podcasts, I really, 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 really appreciate it. This has been a labor of love. I think my sister Kathleen calls them therapy sessions, which means she's probably only listened to one or two and probably won't listen to this one. And another guy that came in and spoke to me last night, a gentleman by the name of Jeff, a regular customer of mine at the place that I bartend on Saturday nights, he came in with a series of questions saying, did you mean to say this? Did you mean to say that? So yes, throughout the course of a podcast, I kind of like when you write an article, there's always going to be, in an article, you're going to have typos, but I guess in a podcast, you're going to have, sometimes where you just say things that you didn't mean to say. And he has, did you mean to say this? One of them in the abortion episode, if you go back in the archives, if you haven't heard it, I had mentioned that women had a fetus, and I meant to say uterus. And at one point, I had mentioned that the mother of my children was the father of my children. So these things happen. So what I was thinking is if you wanted to start a drinking game, every time that I used a word either out of context or a word that is clearly just the wrong word, who knows? Maybe you could have some fun. But today, just kind of a quick thing, again, sort of a podcast about podcasts. And, in as much as the Bagel Logic podcast, I think, is beginning to evolve into something that is finding an audience. And I think that it's kind of evolving in a way that I didn't necessarily plan for it to evolve in one way or the other. So it's sort of becoming organically something. And again, kind of going back to the original, the very first episode where we talked about the difference between Pretzel Logic, which is this sort of play on it's a Steely Dan song, and Bagel Logic, which technically should be more circular. I think in some ways, a lot of the topics that we've talked about with guests and maybe some of the things that I've talked about on the podcast have really seemed to be less linear and more circular. So in that respect, I think the podcast, the title works, but the confusion is always going to be, what does the bagel have to do with anything? And I'm not necessarily going to get into that. You can go back to the first episode if you get into it. But again, it's not necessarily a podcast about bagels. Have I said that enough? Yeah, we could play the how many times does Tom repeat things and we'll drink game. So, as I meet more people too, the people that listen to this podcast, I hear people say, "Oh, I really love podcasts," and I found that's one thing that we have in common. I absolutely love podcasts. Now, some of my favorite ones, I sort of go in and out, but I love like American Scandal. I listen to the Dateline NBC programs and podcasts, so a lot of murder mysteries, things like that. I tend not to listen to a lot of dramas and whatnot, but Serial was one that I really loved, and at some point I was able to interview Sarah Koenig for Serial, and I just went total fanboy on her and was able to meet her as well backstage at a show in Buffalo. So when at some point I'd said to my, I said to my wife, and I do still have them. They're still up in the archives. I have a couple of music related podcasts. One is called Night and Day, the Thom Jennings Interview Archives. And that is really what I did is sort of repurpose some audio interviews with various musicians and put like an introduction on it sometimes. And That one's had some listens over the years. We've had some pretty significant people that interviewed, including Aretha Franklin was the biggest one, but there was a lot of other ones. And originally I was just going to put interviews up there that were from artists who had passed away. So like Greg Lake of Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and John Wetton of Asia. If you're a classic rock person, you know who these people are. But certainly everybody knows who Aretha Franklin is. And then I started a podcast that's only had about 8 or 9 episodes. I may revisit it, called Music Connects People. And the hope was it would be like a discussion about different artists and how fan communities come together, and it just sort of a different format than just the rehashing of some newspaper interviews and things like that. And those were fine, but I don't know. They just didn't necessarily, I don't know, the term somebody used once, I don't know who it was, but they always said that if you're going to do something creatively, whether it's music or spoken word or anything, you always have to find something that makes you sing. That just gives it, it makes your heart feel good. And so far, this particular project, the Bagel Logic podcast, is actually, I think it's actually done that on some levels. And I'm excited to see where it evolves. But some of the other podcasts, I don't know, I work a full-time job and a couple part-time jobs and all that other stuff. And so finding the time to record these episodes is always a challenge. And I'm sure people out there that are busy, they know that even listening to a podcast myself, I listen to a lot of them when I'm driving. So I know I'm going to be in a car for a certain period of time. And the podcast keeps me company. So the content has to be engaging, but it also has to it almost has to feel like somebody's having a conversation with me on some level. So hopefully that's what this podcast accomplishes. And again, today's topic may, up to this point, maybe hasn't been all that exciting and people may have already bailed out, but I hope that is what's happening. So, but in terms of kind of the nagging projects, the ones that if I didn't have a full-time job and I was able to, say, create a podcast network or just do podcasting full-time, like I said, my dream job would have been when I was a kid, and maybe even today if I was able to find it. So if there's any radio programming people out there, I always wanted to be the guy that could do a call-in show. People would call in and you'd have discussions with them. I loved people that did, even if it was a person that I didn't necessarily agree with. I just love that format. Larry King, before he went on CNN, was somebody that people called in and spoke to, and a guy named Jim Bohannon. You can look him up as well. But anyhow, that would have been sort of the dream job for me. Or, morning radio disc jockey where you just sit around and kind of do what I'm doing with the Bagel Logic thing and, talk about your day and what you had for lunch and, whatever. But in terms of like an actual scripted and linear podcast, the ones, there's 2 of them that I really are kind of still sort of nagging at me. And at the, tender age of 55, and I'm not saying that I'm on death's doorstep, but it's not like I have 30 years in front of me to really do creative pursuits. So these are projects that, man, I hope that at some point that I figure out a way to pull it off. But so one of them was something that happened back in, I got to say it's either 1990, it had to be like 1993 maybe, or 1993. And I was working as an assistant restaurant manager at a place called Friendly's. Now, Friendly's was a national restaurant chain in I think they started out in Framingham, Massachusetts. I don't know. I think they originated out of Massachusetts, but there were plenty of these restaurants all over the Northeast. And it was, who knows, maybe it's worthy of an entire podcast episode someday, because it was beyond a shadow of a doubt one of the worst jobs that I've ever had in my entire life. It was just awful on so many levels. And I was a salaried employee. I worked just a ton of hours. Had a young kid at home. It was just one of those things. But an incident happened. I was as assistant manager. You basically had to handle all the lousy stuff that was sent your way. And there was an afternoon. Well, let me back up a little bit. We went through a succession of employees. I mean, I only wound up working there for about a year, and I think we cycled through about 100 employees. I mean, the turnover was just awful. But you'd meet some people along the way that turned out to be really nice. And the community that I worked in was Penfield, New York, which is actually the town where I was born. It's outside of Rochester. I was born in a house in Penfield. And at this point, you're going, wow, that's exciting. It's a trivia fact. Anyhow, Penfield was a well-to-do community, suburb. Just people seemed, I mean, the people that I dealt with in Penfield, they just seemed very laid back, very nice people. And one of my, as the assistant manager, you would have these shift supervisors that would come in, and they typically would be either somebody that was like a senior in high school or maybe, just out of high school and going to college and working part-time. But the shift supervisors, I mean, they were kind of one grade above this sort of, I guess the term that's used is like the frontline employees, just the regular run-of-the-mills, the dishwashers, cooks, waiters, waitresses, cashiers, ice cream makers, all that. And one of the gentlemen I worked with was a gentleman by the name of Steve Fickess. And Steve was, and I don't know that this is necessarily an important fact. I think on some level it might be. Steve was a Seventh-day Adventist, which the Seventh-day Adventists are a church that grew out of the Millerism movement. In this preacher named William Miller, who predicted the end of the world in the late 1800s, and it didn't happen. And I was always fascinated by Seventh-day Adventists, and I've always been fascinated by all kinds of different religious denominations. Fascinating in a good way. I tend not to judge them. I just really enjoy a lot of their origin tales, and I think Seventh-day Adventists, if you have time someday to look up the origins of their religion, it's pretty cool. Yeah, they're probably like, and it was Seventh-day Adventist, like, pretty cool. That's a weird way to describe a religion. So Steve was, I think the reason I mentioned the Seventh-day Adventists is because Seventh-day Adventists tend to be, I mean, they're religious in a way that is, they tend to be kind of mellow, charitable, and I hate to use stereotypes when we're talking about people in a particular faith, but I'm just speaking from personal experience. The Seventh-day Adventists tended not to be like kind of the in-your-face, join our faith, like I'm not picking on Jehovah's Witnesses or Mormons, but Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons tend to really, really aggressively try to recruit people to become a Jehovah's Witness or a Mormon. That's part of their mission. So they go out and they find new people. Whereas Seventh-day Adventists tend to be kind of, just sort of middle of the road and faithful people, charitable, just nice people you want to be around. And the Fickess family was just a good group of people. Now, I worked with Steve for, 7-8 months. And the shame is we lost touch, but man, I just really liked the guy. He was just a really, really good kid. Not, didn't really have a big personality, but he wasn't boring. I mean, I think we all have people in our lives that are like that. Anyhow, he had a brother. His brother's name was Greg, and Greg worked at the Fairport Friendlies. So one morning, I was tasked with we were doing a fundraiser for Camp Good Days and Special Times. And as assistant manager, they said, we Friendlies, we supply ice cream. So we have a portable ice cream unit that we'll need to pick up from the Fairport Friendlies. So I need you to head over there and make arrangements. And Steve says, my brother Greg, he's got a pickup truck, he can help you out. So after work, my shift in the Penfield, and then Fairport was one town away, I drove over and I went and Greg was in the back and he was making ice cream. And he, like the Fickess boys, Steve and Greg were like model employees for a company that was just, again, high turnover, craziness going on. I mean, these guys were they just made no sense. They were such good employees in such difficult and challenging situations as dealing with the public, and usually at a restaurant that was short-staffed. So I popped over. I see Greg. We chat for a little while, and I said, "Hey, here's the deal. You got the ice cream freezer here? Yeah. I got the truck. All right. We'll go ahead and meet in the morning and everything like that." So made the arrangements, and next morning I go to meet him at the Camp Good Days and Special Times, and he's a no-show. And I am... Man, I hate to admit this, but I'm pissed. Like, I am super angry. I'm like thinking to myself, how the heck is this Fickess kid just not showing up with the ice cream truck or with the ice cream freezer? What happened? And of course the people at the fundraiser, they were all irritated, and I just was like, man, I'm furious. And so I start making a couple of phone calls, and nobody seems to know where the kid is. I go back to the restaurant. I work the rest of my shift. I'm really upset. I don't hear from anybody. His brother didn't work that day. Shift ends. I meet up with one of the managers who I was friends with from that other store that Greg worked at for drinks after work. And I said, what the hell happened? I said, I looked like a complete idiot this morning, and nobody returned any of my phone calls from your restaurant. We were supposed to have this ice cream freezer delivered to this fundraiser. And this assistant manager, whose name I forgot, which is a shame because I felt like we were good friends at the time, she looked at me and said, well, Greg was assaulted last night in Rochester. He was beaten up. He's in the hospital in critical condition. And I'm like, what? He said, yeah, he was going to down near the Eastman Theater in Rochester, New York. The kid was a brilliant musician that I found out later. And he was just assaulted. And I was like, oh, man, this is horrible. So within 24 hours, I think, and again, we're talking back in 1993, so the memories sometimes are faulty. I eventually somebody called to the restaurant and said, I was talking to somebody, and I said, well, how's Greg doing? And they're like, he died. I was like, wow. Like he died, like he was murdered. And here's this, I believe, 17-year-old kid. I'm in my early 20s at the time, maybe a little bit later. I think I was 26, 27. Knew his brother, had met his parents because his parents used to come into the restaurant all the time. Just like salt of the earth, just sweet people. And their kid was just, I don't know, he was murdered. He was beat up viciously, and he died. And I am just like, I think like anybody who worked for any Friendly's restaurant, we were just all completely devastated. It put a lot of things in perspective. Again, you work for an employer who's a difficult employer to work for. Everybody's stressed all the time because you're understaffed, and it was one of those, on some level, I could say it's a toxic work atmosphere. It's hard to establish long-term relationships because people are coming and going. But, you have this moment in time where somebody is murdered, and you just sit there and you go, wow. Yeah, man, this other stuff is trivial, isn't it? This is real life. It's not good. And, the whole community just came together. And I remember going to his funeral. And it was one of those funerals where just, when somebody dies when they're still in high school or just out of high school, you're at a point in life where you really are at maybe the apex of quantity of friendships. I was just talking with a friend maybe an hour ago, and he said to me, it amazes me at my age that I have so few people that I can call when I just need to talk to somebody. And and I says, well, that's a function of age. And as we get older, our circle of friends is smaller, but there is a point in our life where there's just a lot of people in our lives, and that's how it is. And certainly the high school years, I mean, you have more of a sense of community when you're in high school together. You're kind of, again, you're able to, weave in and out of different groups, but when somebody your age and you're younger, and again, you're not looking at that, you don't have the same ideas or concept, I should say, of mortality, because, when you're 16, 17 years old, I mean, that's likely the last thing you think about. I mean, I would imagine that, when you look at like recreational drug and alcohol use, that it peaks at a certain age when you do think that you're invincible. Many people grow out of that, and some people, unfortunately, go down the path of addiction. But the point being is that, here was this young man. He was very young. There was just tons of people at the funeral, and nobody had a bad word to say about him, and he or his family. And we're almost, man, it's got to be close to 30 years removed from this situation, coming up on the 30th anniversary. And I'll come back to that in a minute, now that it sort of popped into my head that milestone since this incident happened. But you when you're in the moment, everybody always says, "Oh, this is just a great person," and everybody wants to have all the fond memories. And then once time you have a little bit of space, people are more honest. I mean, honestly, this dude was just a good dude, by all accounts. And I know that his brother was a great guy, and his parents were amazing. Now, getting beat up in the middle of downtown Rochester, New York, a high-profile crime like the Greg Fickess murder, which if you grew up in the Rochester, New York era around that time, maybe you remember it, and you can look it up. But I mean, unfortunately, there's not a lot of information with regard to the murder itself. At one point, there's a radio talk show host in the Rochester area, a guy named Bob Lonsbury, and on one of his blogs, there was somebody that wrote something that this was a gang initiation, that he had been killed because it was a gang initiation. But it's the reality is the crime's never been solved. And that's, it may have taken a while to get there, but I mean, that's in terms of a podcast. I mean, I listen to a lot of podcasts, and there's podcasts where there's murders that are solved through a podcast. And I would say that the Greg Fickess murder has bothered me immensely for the last 29 years, like a lot. I don't understand how the crime hasn't been solved. And every now and then the Rochester news stations or the newspaper or something like that will come up with a story. And I mean, unfortunately, Rochester, New York right now has just become a place where there's a lot of killings. And, but back then there was another pretty high profile murder, a young lady by the name of Jennifer Kuhn. And that one was solved, at least. I don't know. The guy that went to prison for it claims he didn't do it, but everything I could sort of see in that one, it looks like he most likely did. But either way, somebody was arrested and sent to prison for that murder. That was around the same time, but they never solved the Greg Fickess murder, and it's just crazy. Now, I had there's a couple of sort of, and if I ever do a podcast for this, which hopefully I will, because man, if I was able to do a podcast that would eventually result in the solving of the murder of Greg Fickess, I think it would bring some closure to that family. Now, he had a younger brother, Michael Fickess, who, it was interesting because when I graduated college, and as you may or may not know if you've listened to earlier episodes, I graduated college as an adult. I didn't go to college till I was in my mid-30s, graduated in my early 40s. And the keynote speaker was a guy named Michael Fickess, and I saw the last name, and I was like, Fickess, what are the chances? And we spoke afterwards, and I was like, are you any relation to Greg? He's like, yeah, that was my brother. I was like, oh. I said, well, I used to work with your brother Steve. How's he doing? I should reach out to Steve one day again. I mean, if I get the impetus, who knows? Maybe somebody listens to this podcast and says, Tom, I would love to help you develop a podcast about the murder and solving the murder of Greg Fickess. And I've had so many ideas. I have people. There's people I know. Like there was a person that I used to that was on a committee of a running event that I used to do, and she works for the sheriff's department. I think she's retiring, but she was an investigator. And there's been days I just want to pick up the phone and call her up and say, hey, will you help me out with this? Or, my friend, I got a good friend who he runs a carpet cleaning business and listens to this podcast on occasion. And he worked with a guy that was a retired police chief, and I thought, well, maybe I could enlist him, could enlist somebody in law enforcement that could help me get the files to this particular case so that somebody would look into it. And I don't know, just give it one last shot to see that if it could be solved. I just don't understand how you can commit a murder in the middle of the day and nobody knows about it. Even after all this time, you would think that somebody would confess. Now, I had another strange incident happen with regard to this particular murder. I don't know if I mentioned it on a previous episode, but I'll probably talk about it at some point. But when I was separated from my ex-wife, one of the tactics that usually if you're going through a divorce or separation or anything like that is you figure out a way to get your spouse thrown in jail. So she was able to do that and had a restraining order. And I'm not going to go into the full incident. And I wound up being arrested and then held in Monroe County Jail in Rochester, New York for, it wasn't long. It was a couple of days. And actually it was, the kind of thing that was, oh man, it's a story for another day. Either way, I wound up in Monroe County Jail for the weekend. And as it turned out, one of the guys that was a sergeant at the Monroe County Jail was my neighbor. He lived across the street. So they picked me up on a Friday, and the intent was to keep me for the weekend. And he came in, I think, the next day or something. Maybe came in Sunday or something. And as soon as he saw me, he was like, oh my God, what are you doing here? And he sort of knew the situation with, my ex having an affair. And he was one of those guys. It's like, yeah, we see this stuff happen all the time. One guy gets thrown in jail, blah, blah, blah. So he wound up getting me out, hooked me up with an attorney and got me out of jail quickly and everything like that. And but while we were in, he pulled me aside and we were having this conversation, and he mentioned the fact that there was a guy that was in Monroe County Jail not too long after the Greg Fickess murder. And he said, yeah, there was this guy, such and such. And I looked at him and I said, I know you committed that murder. I know you committed that murder. And man, it's like, there's another phone call that I've always wanted to make. I wanted to call this guy. Every now and then I look up his number and I go, man, I would just love to know if he knows the name of that guy and if he was really a viable suspect. And I imagine in the case file, there's got to be, I don't know. So, I think, and going back to the whole thing about podcasts, listening to a lot of Dateline NBC, or maybe even, the kind of kid that grew up watching Columbo or Matlock, we sort of live in a world where we're solving murders or major crimes is just a given. We all think, oh, this crime is committed. We're going to figure out who did it. That's why the Jimmy Hoffa case is so iconic for some generations, because it's like, you would think that if you killed a guy like Jimmy Hoffa that was that high profile, that somebody at this point would say something. So that's bugged me for a while. I think a lot of it has to do with time, opportunity, the right collaborators as far as pulling off a podcast about that particular murder. I don't know, maybe somebody else will do it and be inspired to do it. But I think it's, man, we're coming up on the 30th anniversary of this murder. So, hey, if this topic finds you, and it's something you want to work on together, we'll do it, because I think that that murder deserves to be solved. And I think, again, based on, I don't know, I look up, I just on occasion do searches on Greg Fickess because it just bothers me. I mean, it bothers me because I saw the guy hours before he was killed, because I'd gone over to talk with him about that ice cream freezer, and then within a few hours was the crime, and he was killed. And granted, I wasn't friends with Greg. I mean, I'd met him a couple of times before that. Didn't really know him. I knew it was his brother I knew better, and it was an acquaintance with his parents, and again met his younger brother later, many years later. And I don't think his younger brother even remembered him. I think the younger brother was too young at the time of the murder to even have a real strong recollection of his murdered brother. But, yeah, as I said, I feel like that's a crime that deserves to be solved. So that's a podcast that I've always wanted to do if I was ever going to get into podcasting. And I guess the thing, too, is that with, the advantage of doing a podcast like Bagel Logic is that you don't really have to be super scripted. And, I've talked for, according to my timer right now, it's been 31 minutes. And, I mean, I can do that. I don't have a problem doing that. I think I could possibly do a scripted podcast, but it's definitely something I would want to do with people, and I would want to do it with, I want it to be professional, because there's no point in doing a podcast about a murder if the end game isn't to solve it. Because the other thing that's very difficult when you think about something like this is that you have to be very sensitive to the needs of the family. I don't want to re-traumatize a family. And you may say, 29 years ago. I mean, how re-traumatized can they be? I don't know how you ever get past something like that. Not only the fact that you've had a child that was senselessly murdered, and again, this was, unless somebody missed something, it was a random act of violence. Just a random act of violence. This was not a premeditated murder. This was just a kid in the wrong place at the wrong time. But you got to have some kind of closure and some kind of justice. I mean, if this thing nags on me, and this is just a kid that I ran into 3 or 4 hours before it happened, I can only imagine what the parents are going through. So I want to be sensitive to that too, if this is a project that I ever do. But yeah, so Greg Fickess. Now I'll quickly do the second one, which is another one that it's music related, and it's another podcast I always wanted to do. It was somebody that I met that also had a sort of a tragic end, and it's a gentleman by the name of Vince Welnick. And music fans would recognize the name of Vince Welnick because he was the keyboardist in a group called The Tubes, and The Tubes' big song was She's a Beauty. They had a song called Talk to You Later. And but the thing about Vince is that Vince also went on to play with the Grateful Dead. And that was sort of his claim to fame. The Grateful Dead, if you don't know, I know that I'm not going to insult anybody by explaining who the Grateful Dead were. Everybody knows who the Grateful Dead were. If you don't, a quick Google search will tell you. But the Grateful Dead went through a series of keyboard players. I mean, there's a whole, and some of them at very tragic ends. So first guy was a guy named Pigpen, and he basically drank himself to death. I believe he passed of cirrhosis of the liver. Next guy was a guy named Tom Constantin. He lived, so there was nothing there. Then there was a Keith Gaucho. I believe he died in a car accident. And I think there may have been some drugs or alcohol related to that. And this is all going by memory, folks. So all you Grateful Dead fans, if you're listening, I apologize if I get any of the facts wrong. Brent Midland was the next keyboard player. He died of a heroin overdose. And Vince Welnick was the final one. And actually, Jerry Garcia died before Vince did. But Vince wound up going into a very deep state of depression, and he killed himself. And the story of how he killed himself is just, it's horrific. I'm not even going to repeat it here. But, Vince kind of like the same situation with Greg Fickess. I mean, Vince was a guy that I'd met a few times over the years because Vince used to tour with Todd Rundgren, and I'm a huge Todd Rundgren fan. And the first time I met Vince was in Batavia, New York, which is actually very close to where I live now in Oakfield, New York. And he was at a place called the Treadway Inn. And the Tubes were playing with Utopia, which is Todd Rundgren's band, Utopia is my favorite band. So Vince was there. He was there with a friend of mine named Chris. Somebody said to me the other day, stop using so many last names. So I won't. Anyhow, this kid Chris, I convinced him to take me to the hotel that the band was staying at because somebody had told me where they were staying at, so we wound up there. Vince was there, many members of the Tubes. I got to meet Todd Rundgren there for the first time. But Vince was an interesting character. So he was in this little hotel lounge at a place called the Treadway Inn in Batavia. It's just off the Thruway. The hotel still exists. I don't know what it's called now. But Vince sat there and he played piano, like he kicked the lounge pianist out and he played piano. And so anyhow, my buddy Chris, he was, I almost want to say I don't think he was my roommate. That's right. He lived at the apartment next door. So Chris was really into LSD. Like he took lots of LSD. And Vince Welnick, the Tubes were from San Francisco. So I guess Vince was really into taking LSD as well. So, whereas like me, I want to meet Todd Rundgren because I'm a huge Todd Rundgren fan. And I went complete Chris Farley meeting Paul McCartney on SNL fanboy with Todd. Like, oh my God, Todd Rundgren. But so Vince and Chris, they hung out at the bar and they had this lengthy conversation about taking LSD. And Chris used to buy LSD by the sheet, which I don't know how much LSD that is, but I hear the word sheet. I'm thinking that's got to be a lot of LSD. So he tried to explain to me once that the reason he did LSD is because when the people who take LSD say they're going on a trip, that ultimately if you take enough trips that you make it to the destination, whatever that is, maybe some kind of enhanced form of consciousness, I don't know, but there's the destination. So these trips all get you closer to whatever this final destination is. So I'd kind of chatted with Vince a little bit that evening and everything, but him and Chris, they really connected over this whole LSD conversation. And Chris told me on the way back home that Vince had made it to the destination. Like he didn't have to take LSD anymore because he had tripped so many times that he had reached that new enhanced consciousness, whatever. He made the destination, if there is such a thing. So, but then he says to me, this always stuck with me. I always thought it was a very contradictory type thing. He says, I'm really trying to get to that place where I don't have to take LSD anymore. And Vince made it. But what bothers me is as we were sitting there talking, he's a chain smoker and he's a heavy consumer of alcohol. So he was kind of like, man, I think on some level, Chris was thinking, well, geez, if I make it to this final acid destination, then I won't have to, have all these vices anymore. And here's Vince with all these vices. So ran into Vince 2, maybe 3 years later. He was playing at a club that I worked at called Red Creek. And, Vince was just a sweet guy. And then I'd run into him at, he started touring with Todd Rundgren, and Vince would get me backstage, and just a very nice guy. And again, I had a very limited exposure to Vince. I don't want to create the impression that we were, buddies, like when Vince was in town, we'd go out to dinner. It was more like I'd see Vince and Vince would see me, and I'd go to a backstage door and I'd knock on the door and I'd say, hey, can you tell Vince Thom Jennings is here from, Red Creek Inn in Rochester, New York? And Vince would stick his head out. I was like, where's Thom? Oh, yeah, Thom, come on back. And, by the time he got with the Grateful Dead, I was thinking, man, I got to figure out a way to get in touch with him. But he was just too big at that point. The Grateful Dead wasn't the kind of band where you could just go backstage at the stadium and be like, hey, could somebody get Vince Welnick to keyboards the Grateful Dead and tell him that Thom Jennings is here? So I never got to see him when he was with the Grateful Dead. And the shame is that after the Dead, he just had, from all accounts, he just really spiraled into this deep, deep depression. He had a cancer diagnosis, and he eventually killed himself, as I mentioned earlier. And I actually, if you look online, I wrote a column about Vince and, just my thoughts on it. But in terms of a podcast, I really would love to. See, here's the thing about Vince Welnick that bothers me. So the Grateful Dead is this hugely iconic band that everybody's heard of. There's merchandise everywhere. You can say what you want. At one point, maybe they were some kind of jam band that had a cult following, but they are an organization. People know who they are, and they have a history. They sell stuff. I'm a fan. I love their music. They got their own channel on Sirius XM. But I feel like to a large degree that Vince's contribution and his time in the band is just kind of an afterthought. And I just don't think that that's fair. And from what I know, and a lot of times I still interview musicians for my work as a part-time music writer, freelance, part-time, whatever you want to call it. And I'll bring up Vince, and everybody always has a little story here and there. And I don't know, at some point I would just love to put together a nice narrative about the life of Vince Welnick and maybe figure out why he got to the point where he killed himself. Because I think that's the thing about, when you talk about a topic like suicide, which is, to me, like, I'm thinking, wow, what do you got to do to get to that point? Now, a guy like Vince Welnick, so in terms of a musician, the guy made it to one of the biggest bands in the history of recorded music, the Grateful Dead. Like, what do you got to be upset about? But I think it kind of speaks to the subject itself, in terms of mental health and things like that, and maybe outward appearances and all the complexities that go along with people that take their own life. And we just had that with Naomi Judd. Hopefully I have the right Judd there. And like the day before she was inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame. And it's difficult. And it all goes to, I think, if you're going to do a podcast about something, it should be a subject that you have some passion about, but also that there should be a hope to find something, just something, some kind of resolution, some kind of lesson, and that's always the hope on, every Bagel Logic episode, that there's something in here, whether it be a nugget of wisdom, whether it be something that validates something that you're thinking, and all those types of things that go into what makes a semi-decent podcast or a listenable podcast, if nothing else. And I think that would be, that's another project that I would just love to pursue if I had my druthers. And that was one, I've kind of kicked around the idea of maybe doing a Kickstarter and in hopes that there were some Grateful Dead fans that would want to fund it. Because to me, that's one that, like the Greg Fickess topic, you really just need a team working on it. You need to get the story right. You need to be sensitive to the family members and not, either of these topics, whether it's the Greg Fickess murder or the Vince Welnick suicide. These are human beings that have families, that have friends, that have legacies. You don't want to have the perception that you're just being opportunistic and just trying to make money. I would love to make money podcasting. Don't get me wrong. I'd love to make a living at it. And I think that, but and the reality is, if you're going to create a quality podcast, something like that, it takes money and it takes time. So, I mean, if I was able to, or maybe if there comes a point where my schedule changes, or I retire, or, I've got some weird time on my hands or something like that, those are the types of projects that I would like to pursue financing for and get them done. Because I think now in the medium of podcasting that, again, you're reaching people, and I think that both of those stories, I think there's something there. If nothing else, both of those stories have just gnawed at me for years. They've just gnawed at me. And I said, I wrote that one article about Vince. I think it was maybe the anniversary of his passing, or maybe it was just a week where, I just was particularly thinking about Vince. But yeah, the Greg Fickess thing, it just bugs the living crap out of me that particular murder did not warrant enough attention to solve it. Because I just think that's what, and I don't know. But it would be one of those things that I hope at some point we could do. Well, it sounds like my neighbor's mowing the lawn. I don't know if you can hear that in the microphone, but that's maybe my cue to wrap this thing up. So, as always, thanks so much for listening to the Bagel Logic podcast. Sorry I didn't have a guest this week. I tried, and I'll try to get another guest. And hey, if you want to be a guest, by all means, contact me. I believe my contact information is in the show notes. I'll just put it in this week. I'll also see if in the show notes I can put some links to, like, that Vince Welnick article that I was talking about, and maybe some background information on Greg Fickess as well. And who knows, this could be the start of the impetus to start one of those two projects, or maybe both. And even if it's not me that does them, well, if it's not me, then I'm going to be kind of bummed, but it would be nice to see them come to fruition. So until next time, it's Thom Jennings with the Bagel Logic podcast. Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you next time.